moment. All right, so the recording is on. So welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people today. My name is Erica Eisen, and I'm the coordinator of the Writing and Academic Research Center at AUCA. My colleague Maria Antonova, also from the work here as well. And today we're going to be talking about the thesis defense. We're going to be talking about some presentation skills, some strategies for answering questions, and also give you some possibilities for what kinds of questions to prepare for. So just give me one moment while I set up screen sharing, and then I can begin the slideshow. Okay. And then I would just like to ask everybody to mute until the question and answer portion, just to make sure that everyone can hear. All right. So before we dive in to the real meat and content of this presentation, I'd like to offer some words of comfort, because I know that this can be a really stressful time. So the first thing I'd like to say is that you have already done the hardest part, which is writing a thesis, right? This is the by far the most difficult part, and it's also by far the best preparation for the thesis defense. So congratulations. You're basically already over the first hurdle, and you've already gone a great way towards preparing yourself for this presentation. Another thing I'd like to emphasize is that a thesis defense is not an interrogation, right? The professors who are going to be there are not going to try to humiliate you or embarrass you or find that one thing that you don't know just to make a point, right? They're scholars in your field. They are your colleagues, right? Because you are a scholar as well, and they want to have a conversation and learn more about the topic that you're presenting, right? So please don't go into this, with the attitude that this is some kind of battle or some kind of torture, right? Because it is really a conversation. Another point that I want to say here, but I'll talk about more later, is it's okay if you don't know the answer to something, right? So you might be obsessing about, well, what if they ask me about this one statistic and I can't remember the exact number, or I can't remember the year something happened, right? It's perfectly okay if there's something that you don't know and you can admit that. And again, we'll be talking more about that a bit later. And the last point I want to say here is that the vast majority of students do pass their defense. And this, goes back to the point that you have already done the hardest part and, the greatest preparation, which is writing the thesis itself, right? If you have done a good job of writing your thesis, and if you prepare, for the defense, you take it seriously, you consider questions, the probability is that you will pass. Students who don't pass are in the minority, and it's because they're unprepared. Maybe there's some serious problem, an ethical problem, plagiarism, something like that. It's unusual, right? So I want to begin with some calming reminders. So again, I would ask people to please mute. So the first part I want to talk about is the presentation itself. So I think some students are perhaps a bit concerned about the slideshow, how to do a good job of the slideshow, how to make it visually impactful. So here are just a couple of tips for how to present your slideshow in a professional manner. So the first thing I would say here is that less is more, right? So when you're talking, you want your committee to be listening to what you say, listening to your words, not distracted by your slideshow, right? So this means, for example, you don't want a ton of text on the screen at a time, right? Splatting a ton of text that they are going to want to read on the screen is a way to distract people and make them stop listening to you and start staring at the screen. Another point is a bunch of distracting colors or a bunch of images, particularly if they're just decorative or you're not going to discuss them. That's going to be distracting. So I would think about how to limit the amount of images, the amount of colors on your screen at one time. And also, if you can, similar to what I'm doing here, sort of limit the amount of text and sort of roll out the new text as you're going so that your viewers are not distracted by trying to read what's on the screen. So the second point here is you can use the structure of your thesis as a guide for the structure of your presentation. I think some students are sort of concerned about how to structure their slideshow, what order to put it in. And you sort of already have an outline, which is your thesis chapters. So just to begin, try to make, one slide per chapter. You'll probably need more for some chapters, but just start out like that and see, which chapters need more. But that sort of order is going to, I think, do you very well because it is sort of a natural order, a natural progression. And, if you're concerned, just go back to your table of contents and think about that as the guide. Another point, make sure that the writing is legible, particularly if you're doing your slideshow in person. Make sure that the text is big enough that your committee can read it, and also make sure that the color is contrasting enough with the background, right? So it's not, a pale color on a white background, right? Another sort of related point is if you have, a graph or a chart, make sure that the numbers are big enough that the audience can actually read them, right? Make sure that graphs and charts are clearly labeled, right? So not just the numbers on them, but also the axes, right? The y-axis and the x-axis need to be labeled so that your audience knows what exactly they're looking at. Make sure to refer to the graphs you include, or else just leave it out, right? So sometimes, in the interest of time, right, you have a limited time, you can't always include all of the graphs that you have in the text of your presentation. So one thing that you can do in that case is to put the less important graphs in backup slides, if that's permitted. Right, so what a backup slide is basically a slide at the very end of the presentation that you only look at, you only show if there's a question or a comment from your audience that's relevant to that. So, if you're worried that someone might ask about, some small detail, you can consider adding information or graphics relevant to those possibilities in backup slides so that you're not overloading your main slides with details, but you're also prepared for, potential, detail-oriented questions in the question and answer period. So the last point is when in doubt, use a template. So, you know, PowerPoint and Google Slides, which is what I use to make this, have various templates that you can use where they've already chosen the colors and the fonts. So if the visual side of the presentation is something that is taking up a lot of mental space, a lot of worry, you're not sure if what you're doing is good, I would say probably the best thing to do is just let a template make the choices for you. Choose a simple one, choose a clear one, not one with some cutesy pictures. And, it will make the job simpler so that that's, one less thing to worry about. You can focus on the content. You don't have to focus on making every little color choice and font choice. Okay, I want to talk a little bit here about a key skill for making a presentation, which is signposting. So what is signposting? So just like, a stop sign tells you to stop, or, a traffic sign tells you what to expect coming up in the road, verbal signposting with words, tells your listeners, or in writing, your readers, what to expect from your presentation, and provides information about the structure of your talk and the relationship between parts. So, this can be words like first, second, last, right? These sorts of introductory phrases. It can also be sort of sentences that tell your reader, now I'm going to talk about this, in the next section, I'm going to discuss this, right? Basically, words and phrases that inform your listeners what you're going to be talking about at a certain time, right? So this adds a sense of clarity to the structure of your talk, and it helps you also organize your thoughts. So phrases for opening your talk include things like, today I'm going to talk about this, or the subject of my presentation is this. Phrases you can use to introduce examples include, of course, for example, and to illustrate this idea, something. Phrases for introducing a new section might be something like, now let's look at, blah, 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 turning now to something, or, let's examine something. And again, just as a reminder, this will be recorded. So, I would advise you not to try to write these down as I'm talking, because it might be just too fast. And then, concluding phrases, both for a section and for your presentation as a whole. Something like, to sum up, in summation, or the final point I'd like to make here is that something, right? So these are all phrases or types of phrases that you can try to use to give structure to your talk and make the relationship between the parts clearer for your listeners. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the presentation itself. In the next portion, I'd like to discuss some types of questions to expect. So one point I want to make here is that a lot of students just think about the slideshow portion, right? They put so much effort into making their slideshow that they underprepare for the question and answer portion, when actually that's, also an extremely important part of any presentation, including the senior thesis defense. So here I want to discuss what kinds of questions you might prepare for. And, hopefully this will sort of jog your thoughts and allow you, after this presentation, to start to think about some potential answers in order to prepare yourself. So the first type of questions I'd like to talk about are what I call big picture questions. So what does that mean? So the panel may ask you to briefly summarize your research, right? In other words, to sort of generally talk about your thesis in a broad way. This question seems simple, but people often struggle with it because, their thesis is so long, they've done so much research that summarizing it in a sentence or two can actually be really difficult. But, this is something that you should practice for. So here are some examples of the types of questions that I would put in this category. So something like, what was your research question? What was your main finding, right? Just very general questions. What were the results of your study? And can you summarize your research project in a few sentences, right? So these sorts of questions sort of aren't asking for details. They're just asking for, broad general points. And it's important to prepare for them and not trip up on these seemingly simple, although actually a bit complex when you consider the work of summarizing questions. So the next type of question would be factual questions, right? So as the term suggests, these are questions that are asking about facts, not necessarily analysis, not argument, right? So the panel may ask you to define a term, explain a graph, or simply repeat something that they missed, right? So they're not trying to trick you. They're just trying to ask for information, right? This goes back to the point about, this is not an interrogation. All right, so some examples here might be, what do you mean by a certain term or a certain phrase? What does this graph show? Maybe they missed that information, or, again, this goes back to the point about labeling graphs, but right, maybe they missed what exactly this graph was showing. Can you give an example of, some phenomenon that you discuss? Can you explain something in your own words, right? So maybe they're asking you to define a theory or, explain a certain term, right? So, for example, as you're rereading your thesis to prepare for this, you might highlight special terminology and, circle graphs or images, and then try to, write a definition in your own words or write an explanation of what a certain graph or chart is illustrating, just so that you be prepared for this type of question. So the next type of question I want to discuss is what I call explanatory questions, right? So they will ask you to explain something, your reasoning for making some kind of choice, right? So the panel may ask you to explain why you chose to apply certain theories, use certain methodologies, or interpret your data in a certain way, right? So you have made a lot of choices in the work of researching and writing your thesis, and the panel might ask you why you have chosen to do one thing instead of another thing. So some examples of this type of question include, why did you use method 1 instead of method 2? This could be asking about methods for analyzing statistics. This could be theoretical approaches. This could be sampling methods, this sort of thing, right? Did you consider alternative explanations for your results, right? So you've interpreted your data, but there are probably different alternative explanations possible, right? So why did you land on the alternative explanation? Sorry, why did you land on the explanation that you did? So for example, you used a quantitative approach. What would a qualitative approach have added, or vice versa, right? So asking you basically why you have made the choice to do whatever style of research you have done, but also, how would it have been different, or what would you have learned that you couldn't have learned from one approach or the other? Okay, so the last type of question that I'm going to discuss here is reflection questions. So sort of questions that ask you to reflect on what you would do differently, what you would do if you had more time, what steps, what the next step might be for your research, right? So to prepare for these sorts of questions, you might reread your conclusion to think about sort of the big picture and the next steps or the applications for your research. You might also reread, for example, your methodology section, and perhaps you discussed there limitations of your methodology, limitations of your approach, so that if they ask about that sort of thing, you'll be prepared. So some examples of this type of question include, was there anything that you were unable to include in your final thesis? So, maybe some discussion that you weren't able to include, or, whatever this may be. What do you wish you had done differently, right? So reflect on the choices, think about how you might improve your work. What questions remain unanswered, right? So this sort of goes with the next steps, right? What is left for future research about this topic? And what are the limitations of your research methodology, right? Or sampling method, for example, that would be another good one. So I hope that, talking about these types of questions was useful. I think it's important to say that this is just a start, right? Your thesis examiners could ask you, more questions that are on this sheet, but these are sort of broad examples of the types of questions you might prepare for. So again, as you're preparing at home, you might try to just list these out in a Word document and then take a stab at answering them, whether in writing or in speech, just to prepare yourself for these types of questions. All right, so we've talked about the slideshow, we've talked about the questions to expect. Now, of course, is how do you actually answer these questions? So I want to offer a couple of pointers related to this. So the first scenario I'd like to discuss here is, what if I didn't understand the question? So this is very understandable, right? You've just gone through a really high stress, I think high stakes presentation. Sometimes after that, you're so in your head that it's difficult to absorb what people are saying to you. I remember when I had to present my thesis in progress to the faculty of my department, I gave my presentation, and the first question I just completely missed because I was still so like full of adrenaline that I couldn't really absorb the information. So the first point I want to make here is, don't pretend that you understood. Giving an irrelevant answer, first of all, it will be very obvious to your committee that it's not relevant, but it will also probably confuse them, right? So rather than giving an irrelevant answer, you should ask for a repetition or clarification. So, something, a polite phrase like, could you please repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Or I'm not sure what you mean by, a certain word or phrase. These are polite ways to ask your professors for repetition. And if maybe you think you've understood, but you're not sure, right? So here are some ways to check or verify if you have understood. So, let me see if I've understood you correctly. You're asking blah, 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 blah. So try to put it in your own words, summarize, and see if the professor says, yes, that's what I was asking. Or, no, actually, I was asking blah, 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 blah. When you say X, do you mean Y? So when you say, a certain term, are you asking about something else, right? Try to put it in your own words. And then you're referring to something, correct, right? So maybe the question is vague and you're not quite sure what they're referring to. Try to see if you've understood correctly by asking directly what they are referring to. All right. So what if you don't know the answer to the question? So this is another, scenario that students are often really worried about. What if I don't know the answer? So again, just like it's fine to admit that you didn't understand, or you're not quite sure if you've understood, admitting you don't know the answer is perfectly fine. Pretending you know something that you don't is not. And I can tell you that, if you're drawing on the screen, I don't know why, but it's also showing up on my screen. So pretending that you know something, first of all, it's going to be obvious to your listener, but also it's not professional, it's not the right thing to do, right? So if you can't give a definition, you might try to instead discuss one or two possible answers. So maybe you have an idea for, a couple of possibilities. You're not sure which one is correct. Try to give one or two possibilities. And then discuss what information you would need in order to provide a certain, a sure answer, right? So perhaps you just can't answer the question because there's some information you don't have, either simply because you don't know or because that research has not been done, right? So you might discuss, those exact holes in your knowledge that prevent you from giving a clear answer, and maybe hazard a guess as to what the answer would be if you had certain information. The other point I want to make here and emphasize is it's okay to ask for a moment to think if you need, right? Can I please have a moment to think about that? Or even just saying something like, that's a good question, right? A phrase that you can use to just give yourself a little bit of a pause to consider and collect your thoughts, right? So some examples of phrases you might use here might be, I'm not sure, but my instinct is, right? So again, you're not certain about the answer, but just give your best guess. You're not a PhD student. It's you're not the world's expert. It's okay if you're not sure. It's possible that something, but it could also be something, right? So you're giving a couple of possibilities. I'm not certain, but my hypothesis would be something. Again, giving your best guess. And then discussing information that you would need. In order to answer that question, I would first need to figure out something, right? So maybe you need some statistic or some data in order to answer the question thoroughly, right? If I knew something, I could give a more precise answer. Or, it's difficult to say for sure without knowing something, right? So one point I want to make here is that sometimes the professors ask questions that they don't know the answer to. In fact, that's quite often the case because, again, they're not interrogating you. They're having a conversation, right? And so it's perfectly okay, as I said, not to know something or to just say, I'm not sure, but this is my best guess. So lastly, I'd like to give some final preparation tips. So the first I'd like to give and emphasize is reread your thesis. That's going to be really the best way of preparing. Reread your thesis, be confident in knowing the data, knowing the results, knowing why you have chosen the methodologies you've chosen, the statistical analytical techniques that you've chosen, the sampling techniques that you've chosen, etc. Right? Talk to your advisor. If you're stressed, I'm sure that they will have some advice. Of course, they have also gone through this process, so they will be able to maybe share their experience with you, and also maybe give you some insight into parts of your thesis that might likely be fodder for questions, might be the most discussed during your defense. Attend a defense if possible. So if there are defenses that are open, you might consider attending a defense just so that you know what to expect. A lot of the stress, I think, comes from never having done something like this before and not really knowing, right? So if you can attend the defense, that would be great. Or if you can, watch one on YouTube, you might consider doing that. Obviously, you guys have pre-defenses, which is a good, way of preparing. But this is just another layer on top of that. Organize a mock defense with classmates. So a lot of my friends at university said that this is probably the best most helpful thing that they did in terms of preparing for their thesis defense, right? So they met with friends, they read each other's theses, and they sort of acted like the committee for their friend, right? They asked them questions and their friend answered, and then they traded roles, right? So being the one to ask questions and being in that position is actually a great way of learning, this is what people generally are curious about. This is what draws the eye of the reader and makes them curious, right? So it'll give you insight into what questions to expect, and of course, when you're on the receiving side, it will also give you great practice in your oral presentation skills, and in terms of thinking on your feet. So list potential questions and prepare answers. So the possible questions or formats for questions that I've given here are probably a good start, but I think that this will also be a really valuable way of preparing, right? So write down, questions that your readers might have, and take a stab at answering them, whether in writing and then in words, verbally. Prepare for technical difficulties, right? So on the day, maybe something is going to happen, right? So don't just have your presentation in email, also have it on a flash drive, or prepare, come with handouts just in case the worst happens, etc. So of course, on the most important day, that's always when something breaks, whether it's your printer printing your final paper or what have you. So just be prepared in case something goes wrong. And then the last thing that I want to share here is to check out the resources for students page on our website. So work.auca.kg. If you scroll down, you'll see a big button that says resources for students. If you press that, there are a lot of resources for writing, for editing, for really various things, and it might be useful for you just to check out. There might be something helpful. So with that, this is the last point I have in my slideshow. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. I would thank you all for your attention. And I guess Maria and I will open it up for questions and answers. So please, if you have a question, you could just press the hand raise button, or you can put it in the chat as well. No, nobody has a question?
May I just, it's not a question, just I want to thank you for your great presentation. Personally, I got lots of tips, and I hope we will have nice presentation very soon.
Thank you, Ekbubu. I'm glad that it was helpful. And so once again, I'll be posting the recording on our YouTube page later today. So I'll put the link in the chat once again. So here's the link for everybody. So in a couple of hours, you'll be able to look at the recording in case there was some information that you missed. So if there are no questions, I would just like to thank you all for coming today. On behalf of the work, I wish you all the best of luck. And I just want to reiterate that, if you, prepare, if you give some thought to the organization of your presentation, and what questions to expect, you will certainly succeed. So best of luck to all of you for the rest of the semester, and especially best of luck on your thesis defense.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.